of RSVP design, Webmaster, Sequencer, and Keypunch. And what we're going to try and cover is, first of all, maybe take a step back and say, well, what are high-performance teams? One of the reasons we've chosen to do this webinar is that we get asked a lot about different kinds of products that might be used in team building scenarios or team development scenarios. And it's often really useful with a client to clarify what do they actually mean in terms of this context of working with teams. So we're looking at this phrase, high-performance teams, and trying to, I guess, understand what does it mean. We'll then look at some of the features of Keypunch, Sequencer, and Webmaster that might make them attractive to use in this kind of scenario. And again, there may be some people who are familiar with 1, 2, or 3 of the products, or maybe not with any of them. So we'll try and structure it so that people get a good sense of what we're talking about. Next, we're going to take a look at the differences between each, because I think it's important. And again, the types of questions that we get asked are always, well, should I use Webmaster or Sequencer in this situation? So we'll try to give you some advice on how you might self-select which one to use. And then finally, we'll have a bit of time at the end for questions. I expect us to run for around 35 to 40 minutes today. What I would say, though, is don't wait until the end for questions. If you have questions, particularly if you think I've missed something, then please drop it into the chat box, and Laura will pick this up and, as I say, interrupt me if it's important. Okay, so let's start off with a definition of high-performance teams. I guess, like many people, when I first heard the phrase high-performance teams, I guess I kind of think of the Formula One pit crew. I'm always amazed at watching 4 guys who can, change tyres on a Formula One car in, a handful of seconds. I'm not sure this cartoon that actually comes from our Images of Organizations products directly shows that, but maybe this is just a high-performance team in construction or learning how to become one. But what I'd really like to hear from you guys is what do you understand by this term? So how would you describe a high-performance team? And again, I'm just looking for some quick thoughts, maybe put into the chat. If you can send it to all, then that would be great. We'll all get a chance to read some of these. But how would you describe a high-performance team? What are some of the characteristics that you might see? Is there a particular model that you or your clients work with? Do you have a very strict definition of a high-performance team? What is a high-performance team to you? And we'll just take a few seconds and see if we can share some ideas there. Okay, so I'm seeing a couple of things coming in. A team that achieves synergy, which suggests more than that of the sum of the individual parts. Yes, Mark, I would agree with that. Having the same values, George would suggest. Yep, absolutely. Clear goals and accountability, Julia. Yep, I think absolutely. Laura's suggesting knowing each other well, knowing each other's strengths. Okay, a fair bit there about, I guess how the team interacts with each other, which I think is always useful. Of course, I guess businesses are really interested in this kind of output, a team that maybe performs better than, a lower performing team. So businesses are interested in high performance teams because they tend to perform better and produce better results. So of course, when I was preparing, I did what most people do, I guess, these days when they're doing an exhaustive research. I stuck high performance teams into Google, and here's what came back. And it's fairly common for us when we're looking to develop a product or when we're asked about a product to fit with a particular model. The problem is there are so many models. So just from this first page, you can see that high-performance teams maybe have 5 principles. They maybe have 13 characteristics, if you believe Forbes. Or down at the bottom there, they may have 10 characteristics, if you believe the Huffington Post. So clearly there are lots of different definitions of what this may be, and what we try to do at RSVP Design is to create tools that will demonstrate either a sound theory or a sound piece of research. If it turns out to be the way human beings operate in a team, then a good experiential activity would be able to reproduce that. And here are perhaps some characteristics from Wikipedia, and I know Wikipedia isn't necessarily the font of all good source material, but I took some things from Wikipedia and some from some of those other research to try and come up with a kind of short list that would maybe agree quite well with. And from the chat earlier, it seems to be there. So one of the characteristics of high-performance teams would be that they're groups who have quite specific roles, but often comprise of people with complementary talents and skills. And actually, high-performance teams do value diversity, both of experience and background and skills. And certainly there's a fair amount of fairly good scientific research that suggests that homogeneous teams, or teams with people with all of the same skill set, don't tend to perform as well as those with another. Other characteristics, again, they show consistently high levels of collaboration and innovation. It's already been mentioned. And again, as I say, they produce the superior results which businesses are interested in. Another interesting factor, I think, however, is that they do tend to self-regulate. They extinguish the radical extreme opinions that could be damaging to team development, interestingly, usually without the intervention of any kind of HR. Also interesting for me is that leadership tends not to be vested in high-performance teams in a single individual. Quite often, leadership moves around that group, and that's quite interesting to look at in the context of using experiential learning. They tend to have robust methods of resolving conflict. So again, conflict is not an evil thing necessarily within teams. Conflict can have lots of positive aspects, but clearly teams need to have a good method of being able to resolve it so that it doesn't become destructive. And then finally, again, somebody had already mentioned this, but there's an idea of having a clear focus and an intense energy about high performance teams. You can see and feel that in that Formula One type team. They tend to share norms and values, usually developed over time, and certainly display a high level of mutual trust in each other. So that might be a context of some characteristics within which we could look at some of our experiential tools, and that's the kind of general definitions I'm going to go with. So that being said, for those of you who don't know, what are some of the features of these three activities that might make them attractive to use? Can I just, and maybe before that, let's go back a stage, in fact. So if we're looking at developing high-performance teams or introducing those characteristics, why use any experiential activity at all? What is it that is useful about using experiential methods? I think there are probably two reasons why we would provide opportunities for groups to work with experiential materials. One is that I think you build a stronger understanding of the characteristics. So if you're just talking in theoretical terms, you know, if you imagine that Formula One pit crew, I doubt they sit in a lecture theatre being told just the theory of what they need to do and then go out and immediately be able to do it. They'll probably get some theory and some understanding, but they'll have a chance to work together so that that learning deepens, in fact. And then secondly, they need a safe space to practice applying the characteristics before they go out and do it for real. So there'll be lots of practice, there'll be lots of drilling in order to try and improve their performance. And experiential learning gives you the opportunity to do both of these things. So let's have a look at these three. I'm going to start off with Keypunch. Can I just ask, maybe a quick chat out of the group here, who has used Keypunch? Just fire in a quick yes or no on the chat, and it'll give me a sense. Okay, Julia hasn't used it, and neither has Larry. Okay, neither has Michelle. Okay, neither has Mark. Okay, well that gives me a good start. So Keypunch is an activity that's been around for a little while. You can see the picture at the bottom there essentially is the materials that are supplied. We supply 30 numbered rubber discs and a large piece of rope. There is, of course, a full facilitator guide instructions that comes with it, as comes with all of our activities, but essentially relatively simple materials. It's an activity that could be run indoors or outdoors. This happens to be a picture down in the right here of being run outdoors. You can probably guess that this photograph wasn't taken in Scotland because there's lots of sunshine. In fact, I think this was when we were down working in Australia. And what you can see from that picture is that the 30-meter rope becomes a perimeter. You can't see quite from this photograph, but essentially you lay the rope into a large square and then you scatter the 30 numbered discs at random inside that square. So, and then your group is standing outside the square. So the objective of this exercise is that each disc has to be touched in number order within 30 seconds. So as you can see, the gentleman in the middle there is about to step in. So if his foot, I think it is actually on a disc, if that was disc 1, then the next disc that would have to be touched would be disc 2 and so on. The second rule is that each person must touch at least one disk, so everyone is involved. And finally, only one person can be inside the perimeter at any one time. It's a type of activity which people roll up to thinking, well, this is going to be quite easy. All we need to do is kind of run fast across this square and we'll be able to do it. In fact, that doesn't work. I've yet to see a group who could complete Keypunch the first time they do it, probably in a minute or so. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about the activity as we go along. So that's a brief description. Moving on to sequencer. Again, a quick yes or no. Have people used the sequencer activity before? It comprises of 15 engineered plywood parts. Some pictures here of 3 different sizes that we have. It's sometimes been called other names. Again, it's an activity that's been around for a long time. In fact, we actually tried to find out who invented the original plan, because I think this goes back to military training, maybe 30, 40, maybe even 50 years ago. But we were never able to find out where it had originated. But anyway, the version that we produce is 15 engineered plywood parts. It's got a brief and an assembly diagram. And the objective as well, of course, is the full facilitator guide. The objective in this case is to build a puzzle that looks like the black and white picture on your right there. So the task brief says that what you have to do is build that within a timed 2-minute limit. And what we do is, after a period of rehearsal, we take the parts back, shuffle them up together, and then the group must build that within 2 minutes. So usually the first phase, there's a photo there of a group. I think this is actually in Singapore. They were trying to do this inside. It's trying to figure out how to make that go together. So that might take, as much as 15, 20 minutes to build it for the first time. And then the second part of that is, how can we improve that process to build it within a 2-minute timescale? Again, if you don't know this activity, you may notice from either of those photos on the left that there are sometimes slots cut into the top, sometimes into the bottom of these parts. And the trick is to build this from the bottom up, is knowing who has to put the part first down, and then you can just kind of slot them on in top. So again, an activity that looks deceptively simple when you start, but is actually really quite challenging. So that's sequencer. And then finally, Webmaster. Again, would you put in a quick yes or no for me if you've used Webmaster before? Okay, one, Larry has used it before. I believe you're probably calling us from California, Larry, so welcome. Mark hasn't used it, Michelle hasn't used it, and Georg in Germany, I suspect, has used it. Good. So, Webmaster. Interestingly, Webmaster was designed by my colleague Jeff as a follow-on from Sequencer. When we first started using the Sequencer tool many years ago, the largest piece we carried about with us was about 6 foot, nearly 2 meters long, and it became really difficult when we were traveling. So Jeff, one of the first products he developed within our RSVP design was Webmaster, to try and take some of the learning from that activity, but put it in a bit more of a compact activity. So in the photo on the right there, you can see that in terms of materials, there are 29 rope links. Each of those little metal rings holds a length of either one of 4 colors of ropes and up to 3 lengths. And again, I can explain a little bit more about how the activity works shortly. Again, it has an assembly diagram and a brief, much like Sequencer, and of course the facilitator guide. So as you approach Webmaster, here's what you would typically find. You would have a 1-page brief on the left. You might not be able to read that, but essentially that gives you the rules and the objective of the task. The objective is quite similar to Sequencer. At the end of the activity, you will have 2 minutes to build this structure from a random assortment of the links. On the right there, you can see a kind of black and white plan of how all of these links go together. And the way they go together is according to some quite specific rules, which again are on the brief there. A short rope will always connect to a long rope, and therefore a long would always connect to a short. An intermediate would always connect to an intermediate, and then the colors always match. So a red rope will connect to a red, a blue to a blue, a green to a green, and a yellow to a yellow. So they have some quite strict rules about how they build this, and this can only really be built in one way, this complete diagram that you see on the right. So again, they have to learn how to build it and then learn how to improve that performance. Typically, most groups will take around 20 minutes to build this for the first time. So the performance improvement as a high-performance team is to go from a 20-minute build to a 2-minute build, usually within around 45 minutes of working. So quite a challenging activity. What you can see here is a group who, some of them are looking a little bit confused even though they've built it. That is because they took around 20 minutes to build that for the first time and are now trying to figure out how on earth they're going to build that within 2 minutes. Again, interestingly, this was a group that I brought together in Singapore, a group who didn't know each other. And it's not surprising that an inexperienced group would struggle with an activity like this. You're going to be successful in building Webmaster if you can already demonstrate lots of aspects of high-performance teams. So hopefully that gives you a very, very quick overview of the 3 activities. And I realize that if you haven't used any of them before, that won't give you a detailed insight. And really all I'm trying to do is to give you a sense of how we might match an activity to a set of criteria rather than the detail of how to operate it. So if anyone does have questions about how to operate any of these, then by all means we can follow up later. So here are some characteristics that, and we've been running Keypunch Sequencer and Webmaster for a good 10, 15 years. Here are some of the things we observe from teams who successfully complete it. And again, no surprise, I'm not going to read those out, but those are exactly the same list of things that I had up earlier about what might be some of the characteristics of high-performance teams. So we know that people who do this successfully have some of these characteristics, and I think that's useful to know when trying to recommend an activity. If I go through them perhaps though in a little bit more detail for those who don't know the individual activities, let's have a look at Keypunch first of all. If you remember the idea that people are stretched around this perimeter of this 30-meter rope, typically in a 7.5 by 7.5 meter square, what groups tend to do often is simply say, well, let's say we've got 15 people, we need to touch 30 disks, why doesn't everyone touch 2 disks? So that is simply giving everyone the identical job, and if they try to do that, they're unlikely to be successful. What they need to start thinking about is allocating specific roles according to where people are around the location of this square, and often maybe how agile they are. Can you run across this fast and touch 2 or 3, or do you just want to tip your toe into the square and touch the one that's nearest to you? So successful groups get better performance by recognizing this need for specific roles. They will need to show high levels of collaboration. As I say, typically the first time they'll do this, they'll be looking at it maybe a minute and a half. So how do they improve performance by 50%? So really it's about, can you work together to do it once, and then can you start to brainstorm ideas for how to improve it. Again, we tend to see with leadership in Keypunch, we tend not to allocate a leader as a facilitator in many of our exercises. And certainly if working in high performance teams, we absolutely wouldn't say to someone, can you lead this? We would want to see where leadership emerges. And certainly it tends to move around the teams that are successful. There will be conflict. There is always conflict when you try to get a degree of innovation against time constraints, which is one of the criteria of Keypunch. Again, but successful groups will manage to resolve it. And then an interesting thing that tends to happen, I think, with lots of activities is that the mere fact that people are doing an activity which gets them engaged provides this clear focus. It becomes very obvious what the group has to do, and it tends to build its intense energy. And often when we go to a review situation, we're saying, well, how do we get that same focus and that same intense energy in our project teams at work if we want to create high performance teams? Because that is almost a given because you're doing a very focused activity, but it is one of the things that generally brings success and generally engages everyone and wants them to be part of it. So some of these are quite similar as we go through each of the activities. The slight difference in Sequencer is that when you look to specific roles, it's specific skills as well, not just the parts that they hold or where they stand. So in Sequencer's case, you probably need people who can really decode that plan and take that 2-dimensional drawing and think of it in 3 dimensions in order to create the puzzle answer. Not everyone can do that. And of course, some people will be holding components that are more difficult than others. For example, there happens to be only one piece that has 6 slots in it. If you have that piece, then that's much easier for you, know exactly where your piece goes, there's a lot of dubiety around the other pieces. So again, this idea of finding out who can do what is really critical to Sequencer. Not surprisingly, they need, again, lots of high levels of collaboration, and then the innovation to produce the required performance. The required performance improvements in Sequencer tend to be an order of magnitude more difficult than they were in Keypunch. So again, the levels of collaboration, the levels of innovation need to be better in Sequencer. Not only does leadership need to move around as it did in Keypunch, but typically it changes quite dramatically in these two phases. So in phase one, it's about actually completing something which is there. You've got a plan, you just need to build it. In phase two, you're absolutely in the unknown. How do we move when we've no idea of how to go from our 20-minute first attempt to build this in order to be able to build it in 2 minutes? And then again, there will be conflict in Sequencer. I can guarantee you that. So it's how successful groups manage to resolve it is important. Because Sequencer and to some extent Keypunch have this idea of repeated and focused and intense rehearsals, that tends to build trust, and it tends to build the kind of forming that allow that team to get to perform at a high level. So the activity itself starts to build in some characteristics of high performance teams. And then let's move on to Webmaster. So in Webmaster, again, much like Sequencer, but the slight difference in Webmaster is the scale of the activity. So if you imagine trying to allocate specific roles and see who can do what in a maybe 2 meter by 2 meter a platform, which you would have, say, with Sequencer. In Webmaster, by the time it's extended, that could be a 15 meter, maybe up to 20 meter construction. It's very difficult for any one person to be able to know what's going on at either end. So this idea of specific roles is not only according to your skills and components, but where you actually sit in the organization is probably the metaphor for Webmaster. The other thing that's a little bit different is that it's much more of a fuzzy problem. Compared to Sequencer, as I say, there are some things you can work out on that Sequencer diagram. You know, the only one with 6 slots, the only 2 long pieces. In Webmaster, it's much more difficult. And I've watched groups stand for 45 minutes at a flip chart trying to work out which part goes where, rather than getting on their hands and knees and doing a bit of trial and error. And really the first part of high performance teams needs everyone involved to collaborate to try and find a way through this difficult problem. And again, this idea of extinguishing extreme opinions it can really be quite useful as people get, stressed by the challenge. Often they, come up with more and more bizarre ideas about how they should solve it, and getting people on track and keeping them on track is a big part for successful groups. Again, like Sequencer, there's different leadership in terms of timing in the 2 phases. How do we create a task for the first time? How do we improve performance? But in this case, you also need distributed leadership. It's not enough to have one leader in the center of the activity, because they won't be able to communicate with people at either end of this large structure. Inevitable conflict again, really important that gets resolved. And then again, finally, this high level of trust and norms tend to be taken care of because the group is working quite intensely for a long period of time, typically up to 45 minutes. So that's a very quick rush through, and I'm just noticing some chat there from people looking for some more information. Again, if we don't get to it today, Laura will follow up with people. I think there's a question, for example, in videos. There is a little video of at least 2 of these activities, I believe, and Laura will let me know if we have it for all 3. So, very rushed, hopefully not too rushed for you, but if it is, please ask some questions. But a little bit of a rush through what are the features of those 3 activities. And maybe now let's move on to what are the differences between each, because again, if you're going to select which one to use, and it might not be an either or, we often talk about using our activities in a sequence state. So, you may choose one, then go on to another, then go on to another. Many of these activities could be used more than once, for example, and see if they can improve performance. But my concern with doing something like that is that you tend to focus on be able to do Keypunch well or be able to do Sequencer well. I think what you want is for them to be able to take some of these characteristics and use them in a different type of activity. So we would much prefer to use 2 different activities than to use the same one twice. So I'm going to now talk about a few comparisons between the 3. The first one is probably a bit confusing for most people because we talk about theatre internally, and what we mean by theatre is the general approach and the general impression, I guess, that delegates should see when they enter this phase of training. So what do you want this training section to look like and feel like? So for example, it might be dictated by what is happening before you do this or what you're doing after. So let's take an obvious one. If the group has just been out for lunch, you probably don't want them to come in after lunch and do something that's quite sedentary and allow them to fall asleep. So you might want something that's a bit more active. You may want to change state entirely. You might have been doing something quite process, and now you want them to get them thinking innovatively. You might want to change the environment totally. So in terms of theatre or how the activity might be presented, if we look at Keypunch, first of all, if you've got a group who are seated at tables, then Keypunch isn't going to work. If you don't have any access to any additional space, then it's not the activity for you. People need to get away from their seats. One option might be, and I've seen this myself, we have no spare indoors room, but there's a fire exit and it's dry outside, so couldn't we go outside and work in the car park? Absolutely, you could with Keypunch. You can use that outdoors on any kind of surface. And certainly if you want something to be active, people will have to move in Keypunch. It comes across often as a really focused and physical activity. It's not actually. There's probably more thinking required than running about, but certainly people do have to move. However, it does need a large floor area. If you're going to do this indoors, you need a space probably 10 metres by 10 metres in order to run it. You can run it competitively. So if you've got a large group, you can have several going at the same time. If you've got cohorts coming through, say every month, then you post the best time and say that's the time that you have to beat. So no concern about running it competitively. If you compare that to Sequencer, we have kind of 3 versions of Sequencer. 2 of them we call Tabletop and Mini. You could do on tables. So if you have no other space, you could access it. The Tabletop probably works on a cafe-style round table that maybe takes 10 people. A Mini version, you could get 4 to 6 people round on a fairly standard rectangular table. Again, they're plywood. You could take them outdoors. They're not going to be damaged. It's not particularly active. There's more thinking involved in Sequencer. You do have to, physically move a piece onto the table, but there's not a great deal of moving about, but people are standing, so it does get some energy moving. Needs a much smaller floor area. As I say, if you're doing the standard version, which is the biggest, you probably would do that on the floor, maybe need a 2 metre square surface, and again, can be competitive in the same way that you can with the other activities. As I already mentioned, Webmaster wouldn't work being seated. Quite happy to take it outdoors. And it's probably in the middle between being active or passive. People will need to crawl on the floor. So, maybe appropriate clothing is required. But the first part of that is very cerebral. It's quite a difficult and challenging problem phase, which they need to work out before they actually get too concerned about trying to speed up the construction phase. As I say, it needs a large area, probably, I think it's about 2 to 3 metres wide by 17 metres long if you're using the full 3-section Webmaster. And again, I'll explain what the 3-section version means in a second. Group size is always important, often dictated to us as trainers. So up to 15 people is ideal for Keypunch. It does have 30 discs. You could make 30 people go around it, but that's not a very engaging activity. There's going to be a lot of standing about and watching, so I think 15 is ideal. As I say, the mini one would do 4 to 6 people. More than that, and you can't really get access to the small parts. Tabletop, similar, 6 to 10, and a standard on the floor, 6 to 12. Again, theoretically, you could do it with 15 people because you have 15 pieces, but it's a lot of people to get access to these parts. As I mentioned, Jeff created Webmaster to be a little bit different, so we wanted larger numbers than the traditional Webmaster. You could do up to 30, 29 links, so everyone has a part and maybe one person has a brief. But I think 15 is ideal because then you have two pieces that you have to place into the structure, and it keeps you more engaged through what can be a 45-minute activity. It's quite a flexible activity in terms of size, so you can split it several ways into sub-teams, or you can take out the center section so that you can just work with one large group of 19, which is certainly possible. In terms of timescales, again, this is often something we're given as facilitators. You know, I've only got 45 minutes, what could I do? Keypunch will take you 20 to 30 minutes of activity. The good thing about Keypunch is you can absolutely fix that. So you can say in 30 minutes time, we're running this time trial, see if you can be ready for it. And again, we typically suggest at least 50% of that time spent in review. So for Keypunch, it would be about 15 minutes. For Sequencer, you probably need a bit longer than that, 30 to 45 minutes for planning and rehearsal time, and a 2-minute time trial activity. But again, you could say in 45 minutes from now, we're running it. So it's an absolutely fixed time, and then have your time for review. And then finally, Webmaster, because it's a little bit more complicated, I'd suggest allowing a good 5 minutes briefing. If we go back to thinking about those characteristics for high performance teams, being very clear on what you're trying to achieve is important. So as a facilitator, we need to set these groups up and making sure they know exactly what it is that they're trying to do. It will take around 30 to 45 minutes, and often half of that, as I say, is spent building it for the first time, and then your 2-minute time trial. And you will easily get 25 minutes of review. Generally, I don't think I would ever hold a Webmaster review that didn't have more than probably 45 minutes worth of discussion potential. In terms of challenge, again, depending on where your group is at in terms of their team development, reduced challenge, the simplest challenge of these three is Keypunch. Most teams will probably complete the activity in the time allowed. So if I'm bringing together a group of people who have never used Keypunch before, they will probably do it if I give them the full 30 minutes. Sequencer is a bit tough. They will complete it if they leave sufficient rehearsal time. So if you have 30 minutes total time and they take 15 minutes to build it the first time, they will probably build it inside 2 minutes. If they take 25 minutes to build it for the first time, then they won't. And certainly 2 minutes is easily achievable for a decent performing team. I've seen it built within 1 minute, for example. Webmaster is the most challenging. Many teams will take too long to find out how to build it the first time, you know, and I think there's a lot that can be taken from that in terms of review. You know, it's about that clarity of the objective and that collaboration in terms of problem solving to really solve that challenging problem the first time. The way we tend to do Webmaster is that when you're issued with a link at the very start and we mix them all up before the time trial, you have to find that link. There are lots of links that look similar length and similar shape, so that's another area of complexity that they must decide how to overcome. But again, I've seen high-performance teams build that inside a minute, so it certainly is possible. Although if your team hasn't been used to working together or working well together, Webmaster will be a tough challenge for them. So a few more final ones just to look at in terms of comparison, and these are more probably for the facilitator or the person who's buying the activity, thinking ahead of the types of groups that you could potentially use with this. Keypunch is very much a single activity method. There's not a great deal of variation with that. A couple of things I have seen is you can make the square a little bit smaller. It makes it easier to do, less distance to cover. If you take out some of the discs, instead of going 1 to 30, maybe 1 to 20, if you've got a smaller group. But essentially, it's the same activity. In Sequencer, this idea I just mentioned about in Webmaster, you could do the same with Sequencer. If I give you a part, you must be able to find that part, and only you can put that part into the final construction. That makes it a bit tougher. The option of actually fixing a leader role who has the brief and tries to lead but doesn't have any part in playing in the activity is an interesting way of making it a bit tougher. So that's, I guess, leading a high-performance team. And then finally, Webmaster, as I mentioned, there are several versions, lots of ways of using Webmaster. Again, if you haven't seen it, this maybe won't make a lot of sense, but essentially you can take out a middle section to make it smaller. So just working with a large single group of 20 pieces if you take out the middle section, 29 if you use all three. One option we use is to offer the groups the ability to shorten that first phase. So if you imagine if I give you a black and white plan and ask you to put all the coloured links together, that's going to take longer than if I give you the coloured plan and you simply just have to follow it. So an option may be I'll give you the coloured plan, but instead of your target be to build it in 2 minutes, I now want you to build it in 1:30. So it just changes the dynamic for the group. And then there's a final way of actually building the 3 subsections separately in separate areas and then bringing them all together for the time trial. So more flexibility in the types of things you can do with Webmaster. If you do a lot of traveling like me, knowing how and where you have to take all this kit can be interesting. Keypunch comes in a fairly handy package. It only weighs a couple of kilos and it's essentially in a briefcase size box that you can take on. If you like the larger version of standard sequencer, be prepared. 10 kilos is pretty heavy if you're carrying it about with you. We supply it in a wheel case that can go straight into the hold of an aircraft, so that's probably the way it would get shipped, certainly overseas. Tabletop version, you can just about get in an overhead compartment, depending which airline, and the mini version is much smaller, is easily transported. And then finally, as I say, one of the criteria for Jeff when he designed this is he wanted to be able to more easily carry it around, so it comes in a similar size box, something like a satchel type size box, weighs around 3.5 kilos. And then finally, price comparison, again important for those who are working within particular budgets. Here are the prices of each of the activities. The Keypunch being the cheapest. Sequencer prices increase largely in relation to size and the amount of materials. And then finally, Webmaster on the right. So that's a very, very quick run through. Hopefully, people who didn't know too much about those, I've got some thoughts for them. If you have any questions on either the individual activities or our use of them with high performance teams or any other features, I'm happy to take any questions you have just now. While I'm waiting to see if those come in, I'll get a chance to scroll back through the comments as well and see if there's anything I missed. But by all means, just type in any questions you have. Okay, and Laura's put, I think, some links from there to the website. So I think we're probably around my target of 40 minutes in. Again, I'm happy to hold on if people have questions. If there are things which maybe occur to you later on after we've finished, by all means get in touch, drop us an email, contact either myself, Laura, or indeed Kim here in the office in Glasgow, and we can help you. I would say that we're going to try very hard to have more regular sessions of these types of webinars. My colleague Laura has already got one booked in for next month. You'll find details of that on our website, probably sent out in our monthly emails and also on social media. Okay, looks like we've got no more questions. Thank you very much, Larry, Mark, Michelle, for your kind words. Hopefully we'll see you again. We will be saving a recording of this webinar, so if you wanted to link it for others who wanted to view it, then we'll send you those details shortly. Okay, thanks again for your time, and I hope to see you on another webinar soon. Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.